everybody, and welcome to Community Talk number 18 here with Other Nature. I'm Z, and I'd like first of all to thank our sponsor, Aroha, who has been very generous in supporting us, not just with this program, but throughout the years, and they make awesome toys like the Tamari that I'm holding here. And I'm going to be joined today by Annie Kocher, who is a white, autistic, non-binary, queer feminist doula based in Berlin. Birthwork called them shortly after graduating from Brown University in 2014, and they've been a full-time birth and postpartum doula since, caring for hundreds of families in English and German. In 2020, Annie began offering gender transition doula care. Annie's mission as a doula is to create meaningful change in people's lives through inclusion, information liberation, and grassroots care work. In their free time, Annie loves to spend time with their cat, pole dance, practice yin yoga, sing and write songs, and read voraciously about physiology, reproductive justice, and altered states. Annie is on Earth to hold space for more radical, more just, and more femme-safe world to be born. And I'm going to share in the chat. Did that work? Yeah. Hi, Annie. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Can you see and hear me? Is always my question.
Yeah, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Great.
So you write on your website that your mission as a birth worker is to create meaningful change in people's lives through softness, trust, and grassroots care work. And I'd love for you to start by just talking about the connection between birth work and care work and what that means for you to create change through softness and trust.
I love this question so much, and I can't wait to answer it. And first,
Amazing.
before I do just want to give a content warning for the conversation in general, before we dive in too deep, just to let people know that we might come on themes of loss. We might talk about pregnancy loss at certain times. We might talk about obstetric violence. We might talk about racism, transphobia, abuse could come up, and sexual trauma or gynecological trauma just could come up at some point in this conversation. And so I'll try to give people little flags if we're talking in really sensitive areas, but it's going to be a deep conversation. So yeah, as I engage with it, I just want people to feel like they can turn off, they can take space, they can take a breath, they can drink water. And also the talk will be recorded. So if you don't feel like you have the energy to stick with it all today, you can always just turn the phone off and take your time. And if it was something you wanted to revisit, you definitely can.
Awesome. Thank you for that heads up. I feel myself also just like relaxing into my body.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. Okay, so birth work and care work, and what does it mean to kind of make meaningful change through softness and through trust? I'm going to cite 3 people as I answer this question. The first is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is a really amazing Black feminist activist and writer and incredible soul. And I was listening to her talk at one point on a podcast, and she kind of asked the listeners to reflect on change and what kinds of change we make that we have experienced to be profound and lasting, and what kind of actions led to that type of change in our lives. And she did ask listeners to reflect on when we've been trying to do work within institutions. What has that felt like versus what has it felt like when we have helped a friend or helped a loved one or cooked a meal for someone who needed it. And reflecting on that was a really big moment for me. It just sort of gave validation to what I already knew in my soul, which is that, at least for me personally, I can do the best work on, for the most part, an individual to individual basis. And I think there's a lot in patriarchy and late capitalism that kind of pushes us towards trying to make these really kind of spread out and massive impacts, which I totally can understand. And that for some people is going to be where they shine the best. But for me, I feel like the biggest impact I have is often just on the people who I can look at and touch and sense and feel and know across time and know across boundaries. And those are often friends, those are often chosen family. And in my doula practice, those are often clients. And it's a different kind of relationship. So it's almost like a paradigm shift of, yeah, how to make change. And that, I feel like you can't talk about that without also citing Roger Lord, and just the always famous concept that we really are probably not going to dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Everything is sort of set up to keep the systems in place going. And so seventh generation thinking is really less about reform in some areas and more about abolishment and putting away the things that are just fully dysfunctional, and then trying to look at what is functioning. And I do think it's inherently feminist and queer feminist to like lift up and really value that person to person, you know, emotional labor, care labor, patience, space holding, softness. These are things that are not supposed to be valued, and under late capitalism they supposedly have very low value, especially because the intersections of race and class mean that a lot of these jobs have historically not been done by, you know, just cis women, but trans femmes, specifically women of color, immigrants. These are things that have been historically really low paid, underpaid, or not paid labor. And so in my doula practice, for example, for me, it's really all about kind of bringing that bit back into focus and bringing lots of attention and honor to those things. And the last person I want to cite in answering this is actually Mr. Rogers. A friend of mine, very dear friend of mine, Ben Freeman, showed me a video years ago that was like a formative video for me. And Mr. Rogers was being honored with some kind of award. And when he went up to the podium, instead of asking, you know, or saying, thank you to so-and-so, thank you to so-and-so, these things that don't really track and don't really, people don't respond to them, he just went up and was very grounded and very present, kind of just looked at each person in front of him. He said, I would like to take this time and ask everybody in this space to reflect on somebody, one person, who has loved you into being. And I still get emotional thinking about it. And you could see the people who are in the midst of this kind of like event that just keeps going and going, suddenly everything just stops and there's just tears streaming down people's faces. And there's that one person for somebody who loved you into being. And oftentimes their impact is incalculable. And yet, if you were asked, what did they do for you? Oftentimes it would be these small, simple answers. They held my hand. They didn't leave when I needed them. They saw me for who I was. These are these big, small things that as a doula, we're really working with constantly.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And so next I actually wanted to touch on something else that you connect with care work that some might see as an antithesis to softness, which is BDSM. So some of the points you touch on are, or like the connections you make are the pleasure-pain continuum, altered states, informed consent, DS or dominant-submissive dynamics. And I'm wondering if you could, just tell us a little bit more about that and about why you think it can be helpful to bring these two practices together in a single framework.
Thank you for this question. I love to talk about this. Okay, I have a few answers to this as well. So in the first place, I would just ask people who are tuning in right now or in the future, what would you think if somebody was going into their first BDSM scene and it was going to be a high impact, high intensity scene, and they were going to have a scene partner who did not honor informed consent. They had no safe words in place. Their mindset and setting were not really in their control or something that they had thought about or really felt that they had agency over. There was no plan for aftercare. And they were not literate in nervous system regulation. So it was not a trauma-informed person. What would you think could happen in that scenario? I think, you know, even people who have just a basic understanding of BDSM would sort of immediately code that that was a very ripe opportunity for trauma to enter. But what is striking to me constantly as a doula is that most people do go into at least their first birth experience with practitioners where informed consent is not at all the norm, but rather the very, very, very rare exception. They don't have safe words. So there's no real agreed upon linguistic cue for example, when somebody actually wants to use epidural anesthesia versus if they're just kind of complaining and asking for help and support. So there are really no clear linguistic boundaries or barriers in that way. The setting feels out of their control, and the aftercare plan, like when I ask clients usually, you know, so especially with the first baby, who's going to be around after the birth to take care of you and cook for you and help cleaning, and most people are kind of floored by that a little bit, like hadn't thought about it, but you know, I'll get back to you is often an answer that I hear. And these to me are the absolute basic necessary rights that people need to have going into like a high impact scene. So I think in that way we can really be profoundly grateful to kink practitioners who have created methodologies that have profound wisdom to them. And we can utilize these tools even in a different context. And then it actually also goes the other way. There are things in the birth world that are very well understood amidst the sort of cacophony of birth workers. Like we're all kind of talking to each other constantly all the time, kind of in this bubble. And it's like, you're preaching to the choir, you know, you're like, I wish everybody blah. And the birth workers are like, I know, but it doesn't tend to kind of expand outwards. And a lot of that is physiology and physiologically based methodologies. So for instance, if you understand the hormone oxytocin, which is the main hormone of bonding. Oxytocin is released when we orgasm, when we kiss people, when we hug people, when we cuddle with our pets, share meals with friends, eat raw chocolate. And oxytocin is very much a large player at birth. Really elevated levels of oxytocin are what tend to facilitate a safe and smooth labor process. And if you see your oxytocin dropping, then you're going to see the labor slowing down and potentially becoming more complicated. Mm-hmm. And adrenaline is really interesting because adrenaline competes for the same hormone receptors in the body that oxytocin needs to use. But adrenaline will always because that's just adrenaline's vibe. The body considers it life or death. So it's always going to just go, oh, adrenaline, and grab onto that. That's going to be the most important thing. So for instance, if somebody gets cold, like just to the point where they shiver, maybe they were getting in and out of the shower, which is a common thing to do during labor. That cold could cause adrenaline to be released into their bloodstream, which could then interfere with their ability to receive oxytocin that's in their bloodstream, which could very easily slow their labor down. And not just understanding oxytocin and adrenaline, but also thinking about melatonin. A lot of people know melatonin. It's a sleep hormone. You release it at night while you're sleeping. If you're very jet lagged, you may go and buy melatonin and take it to help yourself sleep. And just in the past, like 10 years or so, we have some really interesting research that has showed that melatonin and oxytocin are correlated in the body, and that elevated melatonin levels will be correlated with elevated oxytocin. Now, what that also means is if your melatonin drops, which for example could happen because blue scale lights, like the lights from unfiltered screens, are going into your pupil, that can decrease your melatonin. If that happens, your oxytocin could decrease because of that. So it's just a random coincidence that BDSM play spaces are dimly lit, that there is a really strong door policy, keeping a sense of privacy, and keeping a sense that even in a voyeurism scene where you're being, you're like showing everybody yourself, you're still within a context. You're within a community context, because the way oxytocin works is it's very shy in the body. So if somebody were to barge in at you, or a stranger were to approach you who you didn't anticipate, or a phone rang, that could deplete your oxytocin levels very quickly. So this is why BDSM spaces are built the way they're built. Now, the same way that BDSM spaces are built is how birth spaces should be built. They should have doors that close. People should knock and ask for permission before they come in. And if you say no, they should not come in. They should be dimly lit. They should be warm, physically warm. If they're too cold, it will not properly facilitate the birth process. These are things that birth workers understand and BDSM practitioners understand, and yet they're not talking to each other. And I really wish we could facilitate these conversations better so that, for example, safe words could be implemented at birth for more families. And that the tools that come from each world could inform the other. It goes so deep. I wish I could talk for hours about it, but that's just like a little overview.
Wow, very cool. Yeah, thank you for that breakdown of like what's going on in our bodies during these intense experiences. Um, I'm wondering if there are other things that might not conventionally be relatable to birth work that inform your own practice.
Absolutely. I think in order to understand the physiology of birth, you really need to understand the physiology of altered states of consciousness. That's the big key to birth that people are totally missing. And it really frustrates me. But it also excites me. It excites me to talk about it. There are all kinds of examples of altered states of consciousness, and they're all cloaked in taboo. So I don't know what culture everybody grew up in who is going to be on this, listening to this, but in the US white culture that I grew up in, people don't talk about birth in realistic terms. People don't talk about sex in realistic terms. People don't talk about death in realistic terms. And so systematically, this ignorance, this silence, this erasure perpetuates disempowerment from within these states, so that the first time that somebody has a really firsthand experience of birth, or their firsthand experience of death, or their firsthand experience of sex, they've gone into it massively uninformed. And it's not the fault of individuals. It is absolutely the weight of oppression bearing down on us. And I am a Gemini sun, and I was born under a disseminating moon. So breaking taboos and talking about the things that people do not want to talk about is my life path. So I'm very interested in the nitty-gritty of all these different things and how they relate. And I started thinking a lot more about death this year, which I guess a lot of people did. Okay, this is not just a me phenomenon, but a global phenomenon. And I got really excited reading the literature from death doulas, because it just felt like, oh my gosh, there's this whole other aspect to my practice that I could add in. Oh, I'm going to go and do a death doula training, and then I will start doing death doulaship. And then I had this really big realization that being a birth doula is being a death doula. I don't think people realize, but about 48%, this is a UK statistic, but it's probably not so different from Germany, but about 48% of pregnancies end in abortion or miscarriage. So that's about 1 in 2 pregnancies do not end in a live birth. About 1 in 2. Yeah.
And you think that's comparable basically worldwide?
I don't know. I don't know, and I would love to look into it more. I know that that's the UK statistic as of, I think, 2017. But if I can find more about that, I can send that forward. But I don't know. But I would kind of guess that it's probably not so drastically different, because definitely what would stay the same is there is about 1 in 4 pregnancies that I'm aware of in Germany, in the US, and the UK. This would be the same. About 1 in 4 pregnancies do end in miscarriage. That stays pretty steady. So if you're a doula and you're only focused on live birth of babies, you are erasing half of people's experiences of pregnancy. So that's what people mean when they say being a full spectrum doula. It means that you can provide abortion care. It means that you can provide care through. And again, these taboos are so strong around these things that when people go through miscarriage or when people go through abortion, again, they usually don't have a lot of information going into it. And they're also made to feel like, because it's so taboo and because we never speak about it and you don't talk about it in, you know, company, and it's impolite and all these kind of pressures to not speak, people feel like they're the only ones going through it. So that is also in and of itself really disempowering and painful. People think that something went wrong or that it was unusual, when actually this is completely commonplace. And even another layer I would add to that is every client I've ever accompanied through whatever part of their fertility journey, before my eyes and senses, they have died and been reborn in front of me. Every client I've ever accompanied, whether I met them postpartum and they were dying and being reborn every day as they adjusted to this completely new self and body and life and family structure, or whether they were dying and being reborn in the birth process, which is a completely normal, standard part of the birth process, to die and be reborn. And I wish more people understood that, because people are so resistant to the fact that they're going to die that it creates a lot of fear around it. And people forget that all life inherently contains death. There is no way to be with life or be with birth without being with death. So it's been nice for me to realize, like, okay, I'm already doing this work. I just have to remember that this is an integrated self. And then this segues pretty easily into the gender transition doula-ship that I've recently embarked on and opened up in my practice. And I think a lot of trans people would identify with the concept of dying and being reborn once, a million times, 1,000 times. There is no, like, the nature of reality is transformation, and the nature of transformation is death and rebirth. At least that's how I see it. That's how I perceive it, and that's what I've witnessed in my clients. So, you know, I am interested in learning more about DMT, and I'm interested in learning more from engaging with psychedelics, and I'm interested in learning more from my BDSM practice and from being a trans person. These are all like threads that I'm pulling in, and none of it is different. It's all the same.
Beautiful. Thank you for, bringing all those things together. You also do a lot of organizing around birth rights advocacy here in Berlin. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What are some of the issues that you find are most important to advocate for in Germany today regarding birth?
We would need so much time to address it all, but it is such an important question, and I want to at least take a stab at it. Oh, I hate that phrase. I wish I hadn't used that. I'm going to give it a go. Okay. Well, I just recently learned in the DIY insemination workshop, which is amazing, with the cocoon midwives. So if you can check that out through Other Nature, this is a really amazing workshop. And I just learned that there is a new fuckery with the law where if you want to, you used to be able to just order sperm for a DIY insemination, for example, and then the sperm arrives frozen at your door, and then it's not that complicated. There's a mucous membrane and there's a fluid, and you want to combine them, right? But recently, it's been true that now you have to have a medical provider sign for the package, and basically the assumption being that this medical provider would take over for you and they would perform the insemination, and that it's not something you are capable of doing yourself, or at least legally allowed to do yourself. But now there's a law that says that no medical provider is actually allowed to assist with an in-home insemination. So technically a midwife would have to sign for this, but then they wouldn't be able to actually perform it. So this really ties queer people's hands when it comes to insemination. So that's just one facet of such a big, massive mound of fuckery. I would say if there's one thing that comes to mind for me, it would just be making informed consent the norm. And yeah, this is definitely a something
in the like patient doctor relationship, or in which relationships?
Good question.
All of them, but
I'm thinking patient provider relationships. That's where I would really like to see this transform. So I myself am an abuse survivor, and so I really understand this. But I will say as a doula that many, many, many people in my practice have experienced obstetric violence and non-consensual procedures, examinations, medication. I mean, it really is the norm, and it varies from mild to horrifying. And in every single case, like even when it's a really kind of cut and dry instance where somebody was like, oh, so this happened to me. I was completely in shock and shaken. They're calling me crying. They're saying this wasn't okay. This was very clearly not okay. And in every case, like once we've done some space holding and kind of settled the nervous system, I will suggest to that person, like, hey, if at any point in the next month, in the next year, you feel like you have the spoons for it, you could write an anonymous email and just let the people in the practice know that this happened. And I've never in 7 years of doing this full time had a single person write that letter. There's always an instant response of no, 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 no. And that's because this shouldn't fall on survivors. Like the burden should not be on us to make these statements and reform people's practices and educate providers. That should not be on us. So I'm definitely not saying that I don't completely validate and uphold and support that decision. I'm just saying that watching it happen over and over, it becomes very difficult for me to see how providers just keep going in the same thing and they never really get told anything else. And clearly training is totally incompetent in this area, because if it were better, then things would be better. And I'm also not really blaming individual providers, because they're clearly doing what they were trained to do within a very inherently messed up system. But there are strategies around that. So for example, if you had a friend who experienced obstetric violence, you could ask if they would want you to write an anonymous note on their behalf. And it could just be 3 sentences. Hey, I have a friend. They don't want to be named. They had this experience. I would like your practice to know. These kinds of things can be helpful. Or if you're somebody who actually does have the strength and the spoons to let people know when things aren't okay. Like when I walk into a doctor's office, everybody's on high alert because they know that I don't put up with things, and I get really, I put up a big stink and I make issues for people. And so like for me, like if somebody's even approaching me, I say, stop, what are you doing? Forecast, like what is this going to feel like? Why is this happening? And let me say yes or no before you continue. And I'm not trying to say I'm some kind of perfectly empowered patient. I have been totally through the ringer, and this isn't not a fail-safe thing, but I guess just if there's any window to normalize consent as a doula, I'm like, let's take those windows. I also think like a really big issue is just that midwives are underpaid and burning out, and that insurance costs for midwives have been rising astronomically over the past decade. So I actually don't know the statistics, so don't quote me on this number, but it's something like their insurance costs have risen like 250% over the last like 5 years or something. Like the The insurance costs are astronomical, especially for midwives who want to support out of hospital birth. And so there's a really big issue right now, especially in Germany, where the demand for out of hospital birth and people wanting to give birth out of hospitals, so for example, at home or in Geburtshäuser, the demand is enormous, enormous. And yet every year since I've been here, a Geburtshaus closes because it's not financially workable for the midwives or for the structure to continue. And so more and more midwives are getting pushed to hospital practice because they can at least make, a couple €100 each birth they attend there. And if they have a family to support, that's a necessity. But it means that we're losing touch with out of hospital birth culture. And we need to see that hospital birth culture is rooted in gynecology, and gynecology has a profoundly sordid history. Yeah, this is gonna, like, the content warning for anything I'm about to say. But yeah, gynecology was not an accident either. It was really founded on the medical torture of Black women, enslaved Black women. Even in its time, people found it to be abhorrent. But the profit model took over, and there's something that I call like the tool justification process, which is where a tool is invented by a male doctor, and then they need to train people in the use of that tool and then get people to pay them to use that tool. And they justify their purpose at a birth via this tool. So the beginnings of gynecology, for example, they were using forceps. Forceps then had a massive grassroots push against them because they were causing so many birth injuries. And people said, look, you can use the forceps, but I want to see research that shows that it's increasing the likelihood of a positive health outcome for me or my baby. And then the research just glaringly showed the opposite. And so they were like, okay, so no forceps. So forceps kind of start to go down and become less common. Now, at the exact same time, episiotomy just grew and grew and grew until operative birth was no longer a forceps birth, but an episiotomy birth. And it got to the point where there are still practices in the States where doctors have never attended a birth where they have not performed an episiotomy. They don't even know what that would be like. They've never experienced it. Now, there was a huge push against the use of episiotomy because people wanted to see that it was going to increase the likelihood of a healthy outcome for them or their babies. And decades of massive studies showed that it did not. And so episiotomy went down. And what did we see? Where are we right now? Cesarean birth spiked right up. Because there has to be a tool, there has to be an intervention, there has to be a justification for gynecology. And I'm radical, and sue me, I'm radical, but I feel that gynecology will never reform in the sense that gynecology will never step away from birth and stop disturbing it, because it has been about disturbing birth from the start. It has been about classism. It has been about misogyny. It has been about racism from the start. It's buried in the history of gynecology. So I'm also not blaming gynecologists and saying that they're not doing probably an amazing job within a very difficult work environment. And I've spoken to gynecologists, several of them personally, who are struggling to provide care within the boundaries that they were given. And they're feeling like people are coming 5 minutes after 5 minutes after 5 minutes. They have to jump from somebody experiencing loss and then jump to a live birth in the next minute. They don't have time to breathe, to check in with themselves. They're in a state of torment. And it's not the fault of the individuals. I guess I would just really like to see us to start having more open public conversations about the same way that people are saying, like, police reform needs to be police abolishment. When I look at people who are trying to lower the cesarean rate, at what cost? I mean, yes, we could push and push and push and lower the cesarean rate, which right now is about 1 in 3 in the States and here. It was like 33.4%, 31.4% last time I checked. So about 1 in 3 births. But if we push back and cesarean rates lower to be more in line with what the World Health Organization recommends, which is a maximum of 10%, I do feel that gynecology will continue to justify itself, because it's like a machine that has so much momentum, it has nowhere else to go. So I really want to see us start subsidizing and honoring and pushing for out-of-hospital birth options as the norm, with a really healthy transfer exchange that's possible between hospital and out-of-hospital environments. And I really want midwives to be financially supported, because if we're going to regulate the system so much, then subsidize them, pour money into midwives' pockets, make it possible for them to do their jobs, you know, pay gynecologists, pay people who are trying to do the good work better, so they can do it and take care of themselves while they're doing it, and so that options increase. Because right now the trend is options are just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Oh my God, there's just so much. And then if you're thinking about trans rights, it's really hard to find information about trans lactation and trans birth. And a lot of my first initial conversations with trans families often revolve around just the basics of, like, if I'm working with a trans feminine client, their question, they don't even ask, can I nurse my baby? Because they've just been told that they can't.
Right.
And I have to volunteer the information. Did you know that you can nurse your baby? Would you like to talk about that? Would you like more information on that? And then it's really frustrating also for me as a provider, because I would like to then send them a few really good peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate what I know anecdotally to be true, which is that this is safe and beautiful and nourishing and necessary. But the science doesn't exist, because to science, trans people practically don't exist. So it's just, I hope that this is the kind of thing where if I actually live a long life, I would love to look back and like talk to the younger generation and be like, you wouldn't believe that I actually worked as a doula in a time when we did not have studies about trans feminine and trans masculine lactation. I would hope that people would go, they would think, you're old, Grandpa. I want to hear that. I want that to be like completely a thing of the past. So that's my dream.
Yeah, I actually also had no idea about that until I was on your Rainbow Doula website, and yeah, looking through some of the resources there. Do you want to just tell the folks a little bit about that project and about any other projects that you're involved with at the moment?
Yes, I would love to. So if you're intrigued by anything that we've been talking about, or if you feel you need a space to connect with me, because this has been deep and we've talked about a lot, my website is rainbowdoulaberlin.com. And doula is spelled D-O-U-L-A. And what I'm really excited about on the website is that it's really easy to find. There's a tab for queer and trans people. And if you click on it, you get to a whole page of just free resources, information, community offerings, anecdotal wisdom. If there is any science that I found, it's on that page too, about the experience of maybe giving birth as a transmasculine person, maybe nursing as a transmasculine person, or nursing as a transfeminine person. These are issues that are very close to my heart, because the information is very hard to find about them. And I wish that it were not so hard to find. So I'm trying to just put it there. And then, yeah, I also have a Facebook page where you can connect with me, Rainbow Doula Berlin. My email is rainbowdoulaberlin@gmail.com. This Instagram account that I'm on right now is actually like something that I made for my music, which is more like my hobby. So it's a little bit more of like my artistic outlet. So it's a fine place to connect with me, but I don't usually post very much about being a doula on here.
Very cool. Annie, thanks so much for chatting today. Yeah, really appreciating all the knowledge and insight you've offered that I think gives a lot of us, including people who haven't experienced or don't plan on experiencing birth, a lot to think about. So yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in. And if you would like to do a community talk with us here on our IG page, or know somebody who does, send me an email at zzee@other-nature.de. And yeah, thanks again, Annie. We look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Thank you. Can I ask one little community thing just while I'm on here? I am
Awesome.
looking for an experienced queer translator who can translate my website from English to German. I do speak German, but I'm not confident enough to make a perfect translation. So if anybody knows someone, let me know.
Awesome. So yeah, if you're a queer translator, get in touch with Annie um, for yeah, that work. And thank you for also all the fans and support, showing all the love. And yeah, everybody have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.